So, when we think about the history of Mexico, what's the story that usually comes to mind? Well, in this explainer, we're going to challenge that familiar story. We're going to explore a really powerful counter-narrative that for 5 full centuries, Mexico has actually been a central player shaping the entire world. Let's get right into it. You've probably heard this famous line before, right? It's often pinned on the Mexican leader Porfirio Diaz. And for a lot of people, it just perfectly sums up the standard story of Mexico. A nation defined by its powerful, and let's be honest, often overbearing northern neighbor with a history just filled with hardship. It's a really compelling story for sure, but as we're about to see, it is far from the whole picture. Yeah, this is the version we're all taught. Mexican history is so often presented as just one traumatic event after another. You've got the Spanish conquest, the defeat in the US-Mexico War, all the chaos of revolution, and more recently, the terrible violence of drug cartels. It's a narrative that paints a country as a victim of history instead of its own agent. But what if that whole perspective is, well, just incomplete? What if there's a totally different story we could be telling? A counter-narrative of Mexico as a global innovator and a real shaper of world events. That is exactly the story we're going to dig into today. So, our guide for this journey is historian Paul Gillingham and his fantastic book, Mexico, A 500-Year History. His whole argument is that the country's story gets boiled down way too often to just these themes of conquest and defeat, when its incredible democratic and multicultural innovations absolutely deserve just as much of our attention. So this is the crucial point, the big idea. Gilling's work completely flips the script. He reframes Mexico not as some nation on the sidelines just reacting to things, but as a central, dynamic force that has been actively shaping global affairs for 500 years. That's a pretty bold claim, so let's take a look at the evidence he brings to the table. Okay, let's start with some political and social firsts that are, honestly, almost always completely ignored in mainstream history. I have a feeling these facts might just change the way you see the history of all of North America. Just take a look at this timeline. As early as 1829, think about that date, Mexico abolished slavery nationwide. That very same year, it did so under President Vicente Guerrero, who also just happened to be North America's first black president. And then, just a couple of decades later, in 1858, they elected Benito Juarez, the continent's first indigenous president. I mean, these weren't just symbolic things, they were profound statements about who could be a citizen, happening decades ahead of their neighbors. And this comparison really puts it all into perspective. While the United States was still fighting over the most fundamental questions of race and freedom, Mexico had already established legal rights and full citizenship for its indigenous peoples. As one historian put it, these kinds of rights were simply unthinkable north of the border at the time. Okay, so beyond politics, this new perspective is really rooted in the very identity of Mexico itself. Gillingham makes the case that Mexico wasn't just a melting pot, but maybe the world's first and greatest truly global society. Let's unpack what he means by that. The core idea here is that from its very, very beginning, modern Mexico was, as Gillingham says, more profoundly globally hybrid than anywhere else in the prior history of the world. We're not just talking about a mix of people, we're talking about a deep fundamental recombination of cultures, ideas, foods, and even biology from 4 different continents. You know, Gillingham doesn't start his history with Hernán Cortés and the conquest. No, he starts with a collision of worlds, all embodied by one incredible person, Gonzalo Guerrero. He was a Spaniard shipwrecked in 1511 who was taken in by the Maya, married a Maya noblewoman, tattooed his entire body, and then actually fought against the Spanish. His children, born from this union, could really be seen as the very first Mexicans, symbolizing a story of fusion right from the very beginning. And this global identity wasn't just cultural, it was economic. For centuries, the silver mined in what was then New Spain was the engine of the entire world's economy. It was Mexican silver that fueled global trade, that connected Europe with Asia, that financed empires all over the globe. Mexico wasn't on the sidelines. It was the absolute hub of the first truly global economy. And of course, when you get this unique fusion of peoples combined with that kind of global economic power, what happens? You get a massive cultural footprint. From art and architecture to food and philosophy, Mexico's outsized artistic influence created this vibrant, complex identity that you can still feel all around the world today. Now, it is so important to understand that this perspective doesn't try to erase or ignore the very real history of violence, of suffering, of empire. Not at all. Instead, what it does is it places that trauma within a much bigger, more complete, and frankly, more complex story. A story of unbelievable resilience, innovation, and profound global contribution. This quote from the Washington Post just nails it. The whole goal here isn't to simplify Mexico's history, but to show it in all of its kaleidoscopic complexity. It's about seeing the full spectrum of the nation's past, the triumphs right alongside the tragedies. So, what's the big takeaway here? If we stop seeing Mexico as a victim and start seeing it as a 500-year-old global innovator, how does that change our view of its role in the world right now, today? It's something to think about.